Hello, my name is Julian Frazier, and I will be your fitness psychologist. Today, I have a treat for you. We're going to go over the fitness psychology of love. Now, when people think of fitness, they don't necessarily think of love. And I, of course, put love in some quotes so you know it doesn't have the exact definition that maybe you're thinking of right now. But regardless, love's a big part of life, and love is a value and a virtue which we hold dear to us in Western society. So let's dig into the fitness psychology of love, learn a little bit about what psychology has to say about this thing that's so important to us. So, first of all, I want us to think about love as a kind of environment. Right? Relationships are a form of environment. And so, within the broader spectrum of fitness psychology, I denote five major pillars. I'm going to give them to you right now. They're physical health, mental fitness, meaningful work, spiritual fortitude, and social connection. Social connection is an essential part of the human experience. And so, some form of intimate romantic relationship or just meaningful relationships in general are going to be a part of the human experience for most individuals. We're a social species, kind of our genetics were brewed in the vat of tribes and bands going back tens of thousands of years ago, right? And so there's something of a biological imperative. Our biology is hardwired to react to these social stimuli and to react to the environment of relationships. And so when we think of an environment, we think of three things. First, we know that environments are things we interact with because we need something from them, right? I go out to the grocery store, not because I particularly enjoy grocery stores. You might find yourself enjoying grocery stores, but I go out to them because I need food from them. Right? Now, the flip side of that is that most environments demand things from us. So there's certain demands that we need to meet of environments. So I go to the grocery store, I need food, but it demands that I give it money, right, in order to receive that food. And so there's this reciprocal need-demand relationship. That's number one with environments. Number two, those actually one and two. Never mind. Yeah, number one is that there's needs that we have of it. Number two is that there's demands that it has of us. And number three, that those change over time. That there's some relationship where the demands of the environment might change. So the amount of money that it needs, the cart that I push, all these sorts of things change, and what I need from the environment might change. So I might go to the grocery store and actually get some toothpaste, right, to brush my teeth with. I'm not going to eat it, right? It's a completely different demand than if I'm going to go in there to get some food. So when we think of a relationship, any kind of relationship, really, we'll find that those three components exist. That there's certain things that we need from relationships with other things and people. There's things that others demand of us, right? There's a reciprocal relationship there. And that some of those demands and needs, wants can change over time. And so relationships seem to meet all of the necessary qualifiers to be an environment that we can think of. And so how does psychology think of love, right? Again, we kind of have the Disney-esque definition of love kind of grilled into us from a young age. And there's different versions of love that seem to float around in different communities. Some of them are spiritual and religious. So we have a lot of ideas of what love is, and it's kind of put on a pedestal in terms of our lived experience, that love is something that we should put a lot of time and energy into. But how does psychology understand love? Here's one way of looking at love, and there's different theories out there, but here's one that I kind of like because it hits on different aspects of love. It gives us some different elements that we can look at. So Robert Sternberg's theory of love comes from 1985 and has a fair amount of research that has looked into it since 1985 and leading all the way up to the present. He says that there's three components to love, three major elements that we can think of when looking at love and the experience and study of it, right? There's passion, which is the emotional intensity that comes behind our relationships and our, it can be love. And I should note that it's not just love from a romantic sense of a significant other, but can also be love of friends and family and pets, that you'll find different components of these things existing in very different forms of love, right? But when I'm thinking of emotional density, I'm thinking of attraction. I'm thinking of how excited I am when someone's around. I'm thinking of how distressed I am when I'm rejected or someone leaves, right? That there's a certain level of intensity. And with each of these, it's kind of like a dimmer switch, right? It's not an on or off switch where it's either there or it's not, but rather different relationships have different levels of emotional intensity, right? And it changes over time, of course. So passion is that emotional intensity. Intimacy is actually the affection and attachment that I have, right? And so I can not have a whole lot of emotional intensity, rather, but can have a very strong attachment to something, and that I identify very strongly with it. I can't really imagine what life would be without that person or that thing or that pet, right? That I've kind of built my conception of myself and the world around the idea that that will still be there, right? It's a certain level of security that comes along with that. And then last but not least is the idea of commitment, right? And so that's the commitments that we make to others and that others make to us, right? And so oftentimes we have to put some decision making into what that commitment looks like. And again, we can make commitment to our friends. We can make commitment and promises to our family. We can make commitment to our pets, and we can make commitments to our significant others. And so these, again, are like three different spectrums, elements that come into this triangular theory of love that Robert Sternberg has cooked up. And once we've taken these elements, we can combine them in different ways. And so we have each of the three core elements here, and he denotes different typologies of love based off of how they're combined, right? So if the major components, for example, are passion and commitment, then you have what's called fatuous love. We kind of get that word infatuation, right? It's that my emotions, my strong emotions towards a person or a thing or my family, friends, and my significant others. My emotions are so strong that I have formed commitments based off of them, right? And the strength of the commitments are sometimes based off of the strength of the emotional underpinning, emotional foundation. So if my emotions go down, then my willingness to commit might also go down. We think of that as an idea of fatuous love, when there's those two components without that level of attachment or intimacy. And so one example of that is the Vegas wedding, right? Where two folks are very passionately in the throes of love, maybe with or without the intoxicant of some substance or another. And they decide right on the spot to get married or to run off and elope or something like that, right? Is that they've known each other for a week or a week or a weekend, who knows? But that they have less of an attachment, but rather these decisions, these commitments are made based off of a passionate basis. If we look at maybe passion and intimacy without the commitment, then we have that feeling of romantic love, right? We have the Romeo and Juliet kind of typical, almost romanticized, version of love that we see in a lot of Disney movies is that there's high emotion, high intensity of experience, high attraction, and that leads to a number of different attachments to this person that we feel as though we cannot live without the person. And so with a lot of passionate emotions, with high levels of emotion, there comes a lot of motivation. And so we're giving them chocolates and flowers and all of these sorts of things that we often see, again, in movies and media as demonstrations of romantic love. There may not, however, be a whole lot of that commitment piece, right? Where these two individuals have formed bonds based off of shared milestones and those sorts of things. And so you can see versions of this romantic love leading up to the ending of a rom-com, right? Where the end of a romantic comedy is something that looks more like commitment, but the phases leading up to that is building up to from fatuous or romantic love. Finally, is the idea that there can be a kind of stable or low emotional intensity, but high levels of attachment and high levels of commitment. And so you might own a pet right now, which you have made a strong commitment to, that you bought him as a puppy or as a kitten, or I guess whatever the child version of any other kind of animal, and you've made a commitment that over the next 5 to 15 years, you're gonna take care of this small animal, and it's gonna grow with you, and you have a strong attachment to it, and it's grown with you, and it's seen you through things, and you feed it every day, and you take care of it, and you clean up after it, right? That's a very strong commitment, and yeah, there may not be a strong emotional attachment. I don't necessarily have a very strong, passionate attachment to my cat, but I feed it every day, and I clean its litter box, and it basically spends most of its time living in my room. So I'm attached to this little fur ball, and even if I'm not strongly emotionally intensely passionate about it, right? And so we can see that there's different flavors of love and relationships, whether, again, those are friendships, whether those are family ships or kinships, whether those are significant others, kind of seem to fit into different categories at different times, right? It might have started as fatuous love and then transitioned to companionate love, or it was a companionate, so it's more than just a friendship, but something happens and it shifts again to a different type of love. What you see here is that there's different combinations of two elements, and Sternberg imagined that if there were relatively high levels of all three of these components, that it would be called consummate love, or kind of an idyllic, self-actualized version of love. So self-actualization is actualization of the self. An actualized version of a relationship would be consummate love, where there was relatively high levels of positive emotionality, relatively high levels of attachment, intimacy, and there were relatively sturdy and secure commitments. Now, these typologies, they have different names. Of course, Robert Sternberg came up with them. They're not set in stone, so to speak. So romantic love might mean something else to you than it meant, from Sternberg and his theories. The idea is that there are different typologies that we can see. And they did some studies after, Sternberg proposed these theories. There seems to be some cultural universality to it. So if we looked at a number of different cultures, different nations, people who would speak different languages, have different backgrounds, we can see flavors of these different types of love popping up time and time again. And so in the same way that some emotions like happiness, surprise, disgust, anger, these things have a certain level of universality between different cultures, it seems as though the different typologies of love also seem to pop up time and time again in different cultures. That's actually a study that was published in 2021. So that's fairly recently. There's only been about a month and a half as of filming this so far in order to publish this. So fairly recent science. There's been some mixed reviews about the validity of this theory of love, though, that, what could we predict about these theories, knowing these types exist? How do we, use it for anything? Unfortunately, there's been some mixed reviews. So there's, been some studies saying that we can use it to predict outcomes for different relationships. Others saying that, it's cool to have a typology that we can look at a relationship and say it probably fits into this category or this box, but the box doesn't tell us much about the relationship itself or which way it's going. That's kind of one of the major criticisms, is that it gives things names pretty dependably, but what else can we tell about it? We can't tell if a relationship is going to go from fatuous love to consummate love, or from one direction to another, just by sorting them into these boxes. And so we might want to think of it from a developmental frame, right? And we can use a little bit of biology and a little bit of neurology, a little bit of evolutionary psychology through this fitness psychology lens, and how we meet the demands of our relationship, how the relationship meets our needs, as a means of kind of taking this theory and giving it a little bit more validity. Hopefully, that's the idea of what we're going to do now. And so we're taking a little bit of fitness psychology, a little bit of the theory of love from Sternberg, and we're integrating them. That's exactly what we want to do with science. We want to help to take pillars of ideas and combine them to form new insights. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at some neurochemical analogs. So it's likely that Sternberg back in 1985 knew a little bit about this neurochemistry, but he probably didn't know exactly what we've discovered over the past 20, 30 years, which is how these things map onto certain experiences that we have. So when we think of dopamine, we think of excitement, reward, anticipation, motivation, right? And we can map that on very closely to this idea of emotional passion, right? Those high highs whenever we are in the presence of a person, or we text them and they text us back. That's dopamine. The feeling when we ask someone out and they say, not interested, the dip that we experience, the drop of negative emotion, that is also dopamine sinking in our system, right? So we can map passion onto dopamine. Now, there's these two neurochemicals, and they kind of have some differences depending on your sex and gender, those sorts of things, is the idea of oxytocin, mostly for women, and vasopressin, mostly for men, but both exist in different levels. So I'm not going to go into all of the depth of how that maps on in biology, but they have a very similar bend to them, and that we can map them onto this idea of attachment, of intimacy, of bonding, connection, the sentimentality behind a relationship. So it's often called the love hormone, or the love or attachment neurotransmitter. Oxytocin is thought of as being why we tend to pair bond for any amount of time. And they've done a lot of studies in various different kinds of animals to show that those who pair bond tend to have higher levels of this oxytocin. Sometimes we will say the whole word oxytocin, vasopressin. Sometimes I'll just call it OV because that's a lot shorter. Finally, we might think of commitment as being mapped onto serotonin, as security, safety, appreciation, satisfaction. When I say to someone that I will be there forever, or that we are going to sign a mortgage, what we're doing is we're forming long-term commitments, which give the relationship some staying power, right? So that, I might be unsatisfied with the relationship at some point in time, but we both share a bank account, and boy, would dividing it up be difficult. So let me figure out how I can make this work, right? So there's some ways that having commitments and some security, some satisfaction, some staying power behind a relationship is mapped onto serotonin. And so using these three neurochemical analogs, we can start to see how what we feel maps onto some form of biology or some chemistry in the brain. And we can see how the brain functions. Then we can start to say how love tends to develop. And so what's helpful to note here is that there are some differences between people, right? So obviously, people are very different, and there are more exceptions to the rules than there are people who fit into the rules themselves. So we're going to be talking in very general ways, but it's going to give you at least one framework by which you might understand how this works exactly for you. So this might change depending on your culture and your upbringing and your beliefs. It might change depending on some individual differences, which are independent of social cultural norms. So there's whole spectrums of romantic and sexual experiences. Some people are asexual or aromantic and don't experience these things exactly the same way as someone in the general population. And so take all of these things with a grain of salt, that I'm trying to speak in very general ways that speak to a number of people, but it might look very differently for you. What we might be able to do is map these neurochemical analogs into phases. And the reason that we can do this is because we can look at a person's experience, and over the course of a relationship, we can kind of measure the amounts of these things that as they exist or as they're present in either their behavior or in their blood, for example, and we can see how they ebb and flow, increase and decrease over time. And so the first phase, that dopamine phase, that very strong motivation that's tied in with infatuation and passion, very high levels of emotional intensity, lasts for about 6 weeks to 6 months, right? And so it can start at the very moment you lock eyes with someone across the room. It can start at the very moment you text and you say, I like you, and they say, I like you too. Oh my gosh, dopamine, right? And then it can last for weeks or even months for some folks, that very strong honeymoon phase. Okay. Now, within that phase of strong emotional intensity, there might be some bonding that takes place. You might spend more time together. You might be physically intimate in different ways. You might cuddle, or you might even move in together, basically, based off of how much time you spend together. And all of that time together starts to increase levels of oxytocin, right? And so within the first phase, the dopamine phase, then with about 3 to 10 years, oxytocin can last. And so this is under the assumption that you don't at some point break up, or you don't decide that it's not going to work or something like that, right? This is thinking about the longest end. So this is a pretty wide margin, right? That for some people, after 3 years, that phase that of attachment seems to taper off, where for others, it seems like it can last for a long time. So they can stay pair bonded and satisfied with the level of attachment for quite some time, right? For a whole decade. And finally, that serotonin piece, the piece of security, the piece of having satisfaction within the relationship based off of shared commitments, that can be relatively indefinitely, right? That the serotonin system can last within the relationship for as long as you need it to. And so you'll see that in the folks who have been married for decades with the S, for 20, 30, 40, 50 plus years, right? High school sweethearts that are still together in their elder years, right? The serotonin is still there. So you can see how there's a progression from one to the next. And so we're going to talk about each different phase, and you might get an idea of how this works for you. This is probably way more about love than you would want to know. And so based off of these differences, we can imagine, and those differences in ranges, we can imagine that different people experience love very differently, which means when you take two people together over time, there's going to be some times where it doesn't quite fit, right? So person A is in the dopaminergic phase, I might call it, or the dopamine phase for a long time. And then they transition to the OV phase for an equal amount of time. And then they transition to the serotonin phase, potentially indefinitely, right? But they don't reach that until a little bit later, because these other phases are much more prominent for much longer. Whereas person B and person C clearly have differences themselves. So the dopamine is very short, a very short window of time of where it's very strong motivation, very strong or high passionate emotions. And then they transition to the OV phase really fast. So they might not have these strong dopamine responses, but they get very attached very quickly, right? And this transitions to the serotonin phase. If you took two people, for example, person A, who seems to go from dopamine to oxytocin to serotonin and these intervals that are very nice and clean, and you paired them with person C, where you can see that over time, they would likely be at different phases at different times. And that can add some discord to relationships. One person's very passionate and the other person's very romantic. And then they transition where the romantic person becomes kind of satisfied and complacent. And the person who was very passionate then settles into this kind of loving, kind of oxytocin driven phase. So what I'm saying is that because this is different for different people over time, this means that a relationship can start off great, and then 6 months, things are going fine. In 2 years, things start getting squirrely as people transition in the phases in their own experience. So let's talk about the phases. We talked about the dopamine phase, the phase that is tied in most with passion, that infatuation or honeymoon phase. It's marked by intense emotional experiences, rumination, right? We spend a lot of time thinking about that other person that we like. With social media especially, we can spend a fair amount of time scrolling through their feed and Facebook stalking them, or whatever you want to call it. And we can lose a lot of time, thinking about this person or the idea of a relationship with them. We're very highly motivated to engage with. They could text us at any time of day, and boy, we would be ready to text them back. This is elated by the feelings of progress, right? So maybe you text once a day, and then the next day you text twice a day, and the next day you text 4 times a day, and it can kind of exponentially increase. And each time, the potential of a relationship keeps this cycle going. Of course, the opposite is also true, that disappointments, setbacks, right? If you go from texting every single day to suddenly ghosted, it can kind of reverse that whole idea. So it's very volatile, or in that it can have some high highs and low lows. And to be honest, most relationships start and end in this phase. And so most relationships fail in terms of they don't go on to become anything more meaningful than a momentary experience with a person, and a person or a thing, or I guess a pet or family, who knows. But most relationships start and end here. So if you've had a lot of experiences through the dopamine phase and there's a lot of potential, and wow, you thought it was going somewhere, and then they kind of end, or they fizzle out, or maybe they're a lot more dramatic in their ending. Know that that's relatively normal. That sometimes just wasn't meant to be. And so what are the pitfalls that kind of entail that it wasn't meant to be? Well, sometimes we're too eager. We have too much urgency, right? And so we do things that are kind of unsustainable. We spend more money than we should. We spend more time than we should. We try to pretend to be someone that we're not, because we want to kind of attract this other person, right? And so these things that seem like we can keep them up at the beginning of a relationship, they might be a little bit unsustainable as the relationship goes on, right? So there's this idea of like the brighter the fire, like the shorter the burn, right? And so sometimes we burn really brightly at the beginning of a dopamine phase of infatuation, but it ends up burning out their relationship before it can progress to something more meaningful. Now, if one person's in the dopamine phase and then the other person isn't, again, that is, it's kind of incompatible, right? If one person's really engaged, really motivated, then the other person might experience this as being a little overwhelming, right? Because one person's on a roller coaster and the other person's on a hike. And again, that lack of authenticity. We're so motivated that we might make decisions that aren't based off of our values or our virtues, but are rather based off of this positive feeling that we get, right? This idea that love can be addicting at times comes from this phase, right? That we're driven by the feeling of love itself and not by the, I guess, motivation to forge a meaningful relationship. And so these are some of the pitfalls of the dopamine phase, but there are some developmental milestones as well that we're going to go over those for each of the phases. And so we do want to, kind of establish that there's some mutual attraction. There's some reciprocated attraction there. And that can be based off of a number of things. It could be looks, it can be lifestyle, it can be intelligence, it can be interests, there's a number of different things that we can be attracted to. We want to establish a general feeling of compatibility as we deepen our understanding of another person. And so as I get to know you, so to speak, there's this feeling that, the person that you are underneath some of these kind of superficial things denotes something more meaningful, from which I might be able to form some commitments to, that we might be able to consent to some meaningful commitments. So it starts off as date nights and it kind of escalates from there. Through this phase, what's really helpful is that we kind of stick to our values, right? Because, what if we are in a relationship with someone who does or prefers things which are against our values, right? What if they're a smoker and we don't like smoking, right? It's one of our values to not smoke. Well, I really like this person, and so I'm going to go against my values in the short term in order to attract this person who smokes, in spite of the fact that it's against one of my values. Well, we're setting ourselves up to fail in later phases when the compromise in our values that we made ends up undermining the relationship itself. So we should be really transparent about the things that we need and the preferences that we have, because that's going to help determine how that reciprocal relationship works in the future. And so if we make it through the dopamine phase, then we might arrive at the OV phase, the oxytocin vasopressin phase. It's a mouthful, isn't it? Well, that's marked by more sustained affection, a deepening of feelings for the other person, and again, attachment, right? It's not as intense as the dopamine phase, but there's kind of still this pleasant romantic feeling that you get around being around the other person. This kind of pink cloud aura, I guess, of enjoying the company of the other person, and kind of these feelings of longing or loneliness if the person isn't around, right? And so in this phase, we put more effort into connecting, right? We trend towards deepening of commitment and a deepening of understanding of something. And so you go from more superficial topics and the things that you can tend to talk about to talking about even the most nitty gritty details of things, right? You start really understanding the person and kind of developing an idea of what that person is like in your mind, which is more realistic, right? And so those deepening commitments can go from, date nights and more personal situations to, now they're meeting the family. Now we're planning a getaway together. Now we're kind of sharing a living space, or might as well be, because we spend so much time together, right? So these commitments start becoming more deep, right? This is also the phase where we start to establish some roles, norms, and expectations. And so I might find myself doing the dishes more often than not, and they might find themselves doing the laundry more often than not. And we start settling into some habits together in terms of the things that we tend to do with one another on average. Right? Some of these roles and norms can be informed by our own expectations, by our culture, by what we saw our family do, what our friends tend to do, right? And others we can form kind of automatically, that we didn't really think that they were things that that we put too much thought into, like whether or not we put the toilet seat up or down. Those are the kinds of roles that can they can come together automatically without us thinking about them. And if we don't think about them, then they can become problems later. So we want to be thoughtful about them. Most of them are pretty benign, but some of them can become pretty annoying later. So if we don't have interest in sustaining contact with another person, if we haven't really formed a meaningful connection by the time we reach the end of the dopamine phase, then a relationship might peter out fairly naturally at this point. We're thinking about, basic incompatibilities in culture, lifestyle, and expectations becoming more important as we start to settle into our roles and norms within our relationship. Because this is the phase that is more heavily dependent on attachment, then certain kinds of attachment styles might become obstacles. So avoidant styles, right? So the person who likes to be chased, I think is one way of thinking about it. So they're sometimes distant, it feels like, or dependent styles where someone wants you around all of the time. This might work out if you're compatible in those ways, but different attachment styles, and that's its own theory in psychology by a guy named Bowlby. Different attachment styles start to become more important at this point. So a secure attachment style, I think, is the preferred style that they say is most healthy. But if we have some unhealthy ways of relating to people in general, then they might become more apparent and serve as serious obstacles. This is also the phase where we begin to know someone more authentically. In the dopamine phase, we might have been really motivated to put our best foot forward. And in the OV phase, now we're kind of settling into some norms where the quirks about ourselves start to come to the surface more often. And so if we have some thwarted attempts at being authentic and to form a unique relationship that is independent of other people and is independent of these kind of idealized versions of ourselves, then it might spell some difficulty for the relationship going forward. And so what are the milestones for the OV phase? Well, we want to start developing some strong, fond memories, right? Having some unique experiences, things that help us whenever we're later in later phases, reflecting on the nature of our relationship. We go, oh, wow, the relationship has been good. We have done some good things together, right? We started to accomplish things together. We've achieved some meaningful milestones. We bought a house and we've been able to raise our credit, and we have a big, those sound like pretty dry adulting kinds of things. We had a puppy together and we raised it and it was great, right? Or kids, or those sorts of things, those kind of meaningful life milestones. And they can be different, again, based off of culture and your expectations, but it's still like we set out to accomplish a goal together and we were able to do it. Overall, having a positive rapport and some form of individual growth is also helpful. And so you don't just want to be able to grow as a couple, but also as independent units of the couple, or independent units of the relationship. And so if I get into the relationship and I stay exactly the same, and then my partner, for example, goes on to continue to develop and grow, then it might spell some discord down the line. And so this is what we call kind of this interdependent model, where we're not completely independent, we're not completely dependent, but rather we can function both as two parts of a whole and as a whole as well. All right, and so maybe a decade down the line, if a relationship has made it this far, the least number of relationships make it this far into the serotonin phase. And again, this might be relationships in terms of a partner, in terms of a significant other, but it can also be really long-time friends. It can be really long-time pets. It can be family members. It can be a sibling who we've grown up with and we've been through the thick and thin of it, right? And so we can enter this serotonin phase in any situation. We tend to think of it from the perspective of long-term relationships and marriages and those sorts of things. So we still have that warm glow of security and satisfaction and contentment, ideally, but it's the least intense of the three phases. So where we were really motivated in the dopamine phase and we were still pretty attached in the OV phase, now it's kind of relaxed, it's settled in, right? The dust has settled, so to speak. There's a feeling of mutual respect, gratitude, appreciation. So love is kind of a feeling of admiration for the other person in the relationship that you've made together. It can last indefinitely, and also for a number of reasons, it can kind of peter out naturally at this phase. And so some folks make commitments that can drag their relationship into an indefinite future. Others realize that they've accomplished everything that they wanted. And we'll look at some of the ways that the serotonin phase can come to an end. Ultimately, folks need to make concerted and committed efforts to continue to connect, because the motivations to connect without thinking about it tend to level out, right? And so before we were really motivated to have date night every week, well, now maybe we can do something else with that time every week. No, we have to make commitments to stick to our weekly connection. Otherwise, I'll go do my thing and you'll go do your thing. And, we still love each other, but I'm in the garage tinkering with my projects, and, you're in a different room doing your hobbies, right? And so we have to make those continued efforts at connecting in order to maintain the relationship as it goes forward. Some pitfalls, and again, these are really hard at this point to pin down entirely. Almost anything that could be what ultimately comes to the end of a relationship at the serotonin phase, especially if both individuals haven't consented to being willing to work through those things. And so oftentimes we'll see radical changes in lifestyle, chronic stressors. If I'm at work and I'm chronically stressed for a whole decade, it can really impact a relationship in the serotonin phase, because I'm going to take that same level of discontent with me in a whole bunch of different areas. Feelings of insecurity, sometimes, most often I should say, financial insecurity. So you'll see a A couple who for a decade was making maybe $200,000, let's say, more than enough money for themselves and some kids and pets. And then something happens and that's cut in half. And now they're just making $100,000. Well, that's still a decent amount of money, but the change in lifestyle and this financial insecurity can have a negative impact on the relationship. Start having these feelings of resentment as things change in radical ways. As we develop as individuals, some of our desires and needs change. And as the needs and demands change in this phase, if we're not really committed, if we're not really determined, that can put stress on the relationship, where individuals might choose to go their separate ways to have those needs met in other places. And so sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes that can be pretty stressful, especially when there's a lot of very strong commitments put together, a lot of, again, financial or material barriers. Some divorces are pretty messy and can kind of serve as a change in trajectory for a whole life, really. So sometimes it's for the best. Others, it has some pretty heavy consequences. At some point we might meet all of our goals, all the meaningful goals that we set out to accomplish. We bought the house, we have the yard and the picket fence, and we have the family, and the kids have grown up and now they're adults, and we're empty nesters. And we've done everything there is to do except for retire and you travel the world. And boy, if we don't quite have the money to do that, then what is next? And those existential questions can sometimes be stressors, pitfalls for relationships as well. And so I shouldn't frame it as a pitfall as being necessarily bad, but recognizing that some relationships don't last forever. And even the ones which have lasted a very long time and have made it to this phase, it's okay if they naturally come to an end, if both individuals are able to elegantly, part ways, or transition, I should say. What are some developmental milestones at this point? Again, hard to say because it's going to be very different for different people once we're looking at relationships that have had a decade plus to develop. But I think continued reflection and gratitude of the relationship. So thinking about, the positive things that the other person brings into our lives, the needs that they have fulfilled for us for not just weeks and months, but years and decades, right? That commitment to connecting intentionally. So setting some time aside, apart from work, apart from kids and all those other stressors, in order to connect in a very mindful and intentional way. At this point in time, you likely have a whole lot of different traditions that you've created together. You've probably done things like Christmas year after year. And even when the kids are gone, you might still choose to do some Christmassy things in the winter holidays, because those are traditions that you share together, and they have some values behind them that you've likely created within the relationship and passed on. And then, being willing to evaluate the relationship, deconstruct or take apart the things that aren't working, and then put the things back together to meet new needs and demands as they progress throughout our development into adulthood and into our older adulthood, etc., is something that will keep a relationship moving through the serotonin phase. So again, it is to say that I think there's a saying that relationships are for a reason, a season, or a lifetime. And it might be that they're together for a passionate, an attachment, or a commitment, if we were going to look at the three triangles of the theory of love. And so here is what to summarize, here's what we could see if we were to integrate all of these together. So we have Sternberg's, triangle here and some of his labels of love. And then we've kind of circumvented it with this whole neurological, biological idea of what that can look like in the brain and how that's expressed. And we can see that there are some patterns that might play out. And so it might start in the dopamine phase for most people, transition through romantic love towards a more oxytocin, vasopressin, OV phase, and then transition through companionate love to a more serotonin phase. And so we can take something which maybe doesn't have a lot of validity in terms of what does it predict in the future, And we can start to see that with an analog of neurobiology and fitness psychology, in terms of how this relationship to the environment to social environment, I should say, fits together in a very phasic way. Now, these phases might look different for different people, right? So it might start and end in different places, but it might be that for you, that it starts and ends very similarly from one relationship to another. So it might not look like this for you, but once you figure out how it works for you, it might work very similarly for different relationships. Or the opposite might also be true, that it looks very similar to this for one kind of relationship with one person, but with another person, it looks very different. And so there's a lot of complexity, of course, that comes into this. There's one person that you are, but there's billions of people and thus billions of potential relationships. And some of them are friendships and some of them are acquaintanceships and some of them can be much deeper than that. Of course, take everything with a grain of salt. Trying to summarize something so complex can be a little bit difficult, but that's the fun of fitness psychology. So we can take something like the idea of fitness and then talk about love for 30 minutes or more. And so what's some frequently asked questions? One is is consummate love, from Sternberg's idea, the idea that passion, intimacy, and commitment, coming together, is it possible? And it turns out that, yeah, probably it is. That at some point in time, we can have dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin floating around in our brain at the same time. If that's too biological for you, then yes, that we can have intimacy, passion, and commitment with the same person. And also, it may not be forever, right? This kind of think of it as the stars aligning for two people, that some folks are highly compatible for a time and that it can change over time. So I think they did a study, and don't quote me on this because I don't have the citation right off my head, but there's only like 3% of relationships which have maintained a blissful state for the whole duration of their relationship. And for others, it's more a kind of cycle of, there's a rupture, that something happens, that there's something that was once compatible that's no longer compatible. And then there's repair, where the two individuals look at what went wrong and then try to fix it. And then there's kind of this restitution phase where you enjoy the newfound repaired state. And it's kind of a cycle where it does that. So it's not always great. It's the nature of long-term relationships, is that they do fail. So they do fail sometimes, and then you repair them sometimes, and sometimes they fail forever. That doesn't sound very optimistic or hopeful. And also, if you find yourself in that space of consummate love, enjoy it for exactly what it is. Are there such things as soulmates? And unfortunately, from the perspective of psychology, probably not. That's the unoptimistic side of it, that it's not likely that there's one other person sitting out in the world waiting for you, and you just have to sort cards until you find the right one, swipe left or right until you find your soulmate. But rather, it's likely that there's tens of thousands, if not more, people with whom you are compatible with. It just so happens that a few decades, maybe 100 years ago, the people that you knew were in your community and not too much further from that if you only knew a few thousand people, that you could probably pick one out of them. Well, today, in a more global environment, especially in urban settings, you probably pass that many people on the way to work. And so the idea of a soulmate is probably actually underselling the amount of people whom, if you met, you would be able to form a meaningful relationship with. Now, a common question: my relationship has lost its spark. How do I get more of that dopamine stuff? Well, that's going to take a little bit of creativity. It's not impossible to re-spark a sparkless relationship. And also, the things which tend to increase dopamine also decrease kind of security and certainty. So serotonin and dopamine kind of exist in the brain as agonist and antagonist sometimes. right? And so if I'm motivated to get something, it usually means that I don't already have it. Right? I'm not super motivated to get something that I have. And so it's usually that if I'm feeling insecure, dopamine actually creeps up a little bit in order to motivate me to rectify that insecurity. If you're looking to add some spark into your relationship by shaking things up a little bit, that can work. And also, if the relationship doesn't have a really strong foundation to begin with, then it can also damage the relationship. So, for those looking to add some spark back to their relationship, do some evaluating around how secure your relationship is to begin with, because trying to shake things up in the relationship in order to make it more exciting might also be the cause of the end of the relationship. And another question is, does this mean that my, sex intimacy life with my partner is doomed? Say we've already gone through the dopamine phase and we were having sex and we were together every single day, it felt like, and then things kind of petered off. And now I'm lucky if it's every month. And I'm afraid that we are out of the 6-week to 6-month window where we were really motivated. Well, not necessarily. Again, in the same way that we had to keep commitment to connection, that it just takes sometimes a little bit more effort and a little bit more planning than it took in the earlier phases where we were much more motivated by strong emotions. So those are the kinds of things that people go to couples therapy for all the time, because it's like, wait a second, this thing that was used to be automatic and used to be really passionate and exciting, it's not anymore. And most people don't realize that that's kind of, for a lot of relationships, the normal ebb and flow. And so it takes a little bit more effort than it did when it was almost automatic. And that's not necessarily a problem to put more effort into your relationship. So those are some frequently asked questions. I'm curious what questions that you have. I have tried to speed through a number of these things and threw a lot of words at you. But if I was going to take a fitness psychology spin to some other questions, especially around love and relationships and intimacy and all those sorts of things, what would you want to know? You can leave it a comment in the comments section. You can DM me on Instagram, or you can Facebook message me or email me. I'm curious what kinds of questions you have. And who knows, if we have enough questions to have like a follow-up video, which is just frequently asked questions, then that would be something that would be fun. I'd look forward to that. Again, I'm Julian Frazier, being your fitness psychologist, bringing fitness psychology for free online, without ads and all those things, for as long as I can help it, in exchange for maybe not the best production value. I would like to change that in the inevitable future, and to be able to make these things a little bit more entertaining. But right now, what I'm focusing on is delivering these weekly and free. So I appreciate your support. I appreciate the likes and comments, and when you message me and tell me that what you're watching is fun or helpful in some ways. So like and subscribe and those sorts of things, because they're the things that give me some dopamine at the end of the day after I put a lot of time and effort into these. Have a good weekend. Have a good week if you're watching this and it's not in proximity to a weekend, and just, have a generally good life. Okay, bye. Oh, how do I end this? There it is.